So we have the sufficient and appropriate evidence. Now, the evidence, no, or the sufficient and appropriate evidence serves as the basis of the practitioner's conclusion. So, without obtaining evidence, the practitioner cannot conclude whether the subject matter information is fairly stated or not. So, that is why this is a very important aspect of the assurance engagement. So, that provides the practitioner or the CPA an objective basis for his or her report. And take note also that the practitioner, in performing his or her duty, plans and perform the assurance engagement with an attitude of professional skepticism. So take note of this. This will be a very important concept in our present and future discussions. Okay? So we perform our procedure with an attitude of professional skepticism to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence about whether the subject matter information is free from material misstatement. So the professional skepticism that we maintain is an attitude, no, recognizing that circumstances may exist that cause the subject matter information to be materially misstated. So that is why we should always be alert. So about the evidence being provided to us, about the representation being provided to us in deciding the context or within the context of the engagement. So meaning we make critical assessment with a questioning mind, okay, about the validity of the evidence obtained, and we are alert to evidence that either contradicts or brings into question the reliability of evidence or documents or representations made by the responsible party. So that means when we are presented with evidence, we do not automatically accept them at face value. So we have to corroborate or confirm or find supporting information. And we should always be alert with any information that will contradict or oppose those information provided to us by the responsible party. And finally, in gathering sufficient and appropriate evidence, we also consider materiality, assurance engagement risk, and quantity and quality of evidence. So we'll discuss these items in detail in the next section. So first, let's talk about materiality. Materiality is relevant when we determine our nature, time, and extent of procedures, and when assessing whether the subject matter information is free from misstatement. But the question is, what is a material information? An information is considered material if it affects the decision of the users when the information is misstated or omitted. However, take note also that materiality is relative. It depends on the size or nature of an item. So, for example, an amount that is considered material to one entity may not be material to another. For example, an expenditure amounting to 10,000 pesos may be material to an individually owned business, but it may not be that material for a multi-billion conglomerate. But take note also that materiality is not only affected by size or amount, so but also by nature. So like for example, an item proceeding from fraud will be considered material regardless of the amount involved. Now, ultimately, the decision on whether an information is material or not rests with the practitioner's professional judgment. The next question is that what is the effect of materiality to evidence? Now, the effect of materiality to evidence is inverse or opposite. So, meaning to say, the lower the materiality level, then the more extensive would be the evidence gathering procedures that the practitioner is expected to perform. So, let's say, if we set a very low materiality level, so let's say the materiality level is 1 peso, that means that even a 1 peso misstatement can already affect the decision of the users using the subject matter information. So therefore, we will examine documents though with amount of 1 peso and above, therefore increasing the scope of our examination. So compared to, for example, a higher materiality level, let's say the materiality level is 100,000. So in that case, we will be concerned only to items or transactions that normally have 100,000 pesos and above amount or range. So in that case, those transactions that are below 100,000, we will not put too much focus on them. So therefore, lowering the amount of procedures that we need to perform. So another item that affect our evidence gathering procedure is the assurance engagement risk. So assurance engagement risk is the risk that the practitioner expresses an inappropriate conclusion when the subject matter information is materially misstated. So to emphasize, there must be two factors present for an assurance engagement risk to arise. First, the subject matter is materially misstated, and second, the practitioner issued inappropriate conclusion. So despite the fact that the subject matter is materially misstated. So this is the situation that we wanted to avoid or that we want to avoid in practice. So because if this happened, okay, so that means that the conclusions that we have issued to our client is incorrect, or the conclusion that we have issued to the users of the information is incorrect. So that is why, as much as possible, practitioners want to issue a conclusion that is appropriate in the circumstances. So that is why also the practitioner want to decrease the assurance engagement risk present in an engagement. So having a high assurance engagement risk means that the chance to issue an incorrect conclusion is also high. So therefore, our goal in every engagement is to reduce as much as possible the risk of issuing incorrect conclusion. So therefore, what will be the effect on the evidence that we have to obtain? So we have to consider the risk when determining the nature, time, and extent of evidence gathering procedures. So the relationship is also opposite. So meaning, the more extensive would be the evidence gathering procedures, the lower the chances that we would issue incorrect opinion or incorrect conclusion. So and therefore, the lower would be the evidence gathering procedures involved. So for example, we perform less procedures. The higher also would be the chance to issue an incorrect conclusion. So that is why in planning our procedure, we have to consider what level of assurance engagement risk we want to achieve. And therefore, we can adjust our procedures related to our goal of achieving a certain level of assurance engagement risk. So finally, we have quantity and quality of evidence. So another consideration when it comes to gathering evidence is its sufficiency and appropriateness. So sufficiency is the measure of quantity of evidence, while appropriateness is the measure of quality of evidence. So another name for appropriateness of evidence is competence of evidence. So first, let's talk about quantity. So the quantity of evidence is affected by the risk of the subject matter information. So meaning to say, the higher the risk of the subject matter information, then the more evidence is required. Conversely, conversely, if the risk of the subject matter information is lower, then we will also need less evidence. So since the risk is lower. So another item that can affect the quantity of evidence is the quality. The higher the quality of the evidence, then the less may be required. However, the opposite is not applicable. So meaning, if the quality of evidence is poor, it will not compensate if we obtain more evidence. So unlike the relationship earlier with the risk of the subject matter information, the higher the risk, the more evidence is required. The lower the risk, then probably less evidence could be acceptable. But in case of quality, if the quality is high, less may be required. But if the quality is poor, we cannot compensate it by merely obtaining more evidence. So take note of that. On the other hand, the quality of evidence is affected by its relevance and reliability. So an evidence is relevant if it has the ability to address the objective of the procedure. So, for example, if you are performing an audit procedure that validates completeness, an evidence would be considered relevant if it contributes to the conclusion that the item that you are examining is complete or not. So, otherwise, if the evidence will not contribute to your conclusion about the completeness of the item, then that evidence is not relevant. The next we have reliability. So reliability talks about the validity of the evidence. So there are generalizations about the reliability of evidence, but these generalizations are subject to important exceptions. So meaning to say these are not absolute truth, but only guide for us practitioner in approaching the reliability of evidence. So So again, when we talk about reliability of evidence, we're talking about the validity of evidence. So normally we obtain more assurance from consistent evidence that we obtain from different sources or from a different nature of items rather than considering them individually. So also we obtain evidence from different sources or of different nature that may indicate no, that an individual item of evidence is not reliable. So, but generally, here are some generalizations about the reliability of evidence. Evidence is considered more reliable if it was obtained from independent sources, so rather than uh, those evidence generated internally by the entity. But for those generated internally by the entity, evidence is considered more reliable when the related controls are effective, no, compared to those evidence that are generated under a poor environment of internal control. Another generalization is that evidence is considered more reliable if obtained directly by the CPA, so rather than by inference. Evidence is considered more reliable if it exists in written or documentary form rather than from oral evidence. And finally, evidence is considered more reliable if it exists in original form rather than in duplicate like photocopies or scanned documents. And then finally, so we also have cost benefit consideration. So we have to consider the relationship between the cost of obtaining benefit and the benefit that can be derived from the evidence. So for example, if there are two alternative sources of evidence, but one is most or the one is more costly than the other, then we may decide to choose the cheaper no alternative. However, the matter of difficulty or expense no involved of in obtaining an evidence is not on itself a valid basis to meet an evidence gathering procedure for which there is no alternative. So let's say there is only one alternative in obtaining the evidence, but the cost is high or it is difficult to obtain the evidence. So it's not an excuse not to collect or not to perform or not to gather that evidence or not to perform the procedure. Ultimately, the decision whether the evidence obtained is sufficient and appropriate rests with the professional judgment of the practitioner. So that is why the role of professional judgment is very important in the performance of our procedures. So we will discuss that in a separate topic. So we're down to the last element. So the last and fifth element, we have the written assurance report. So the written assurance report communicates to the users the conclusion or the opinion reached by the practitioner. So it should be in writing. So whether in hard copy format, so meaning written, printed, or in computerized format, also known as soft copy. So both are acceptable form of written assurance report. So but it will still depend on the local regulation for specific assurance engagements. And then the level of assurance brought by the conclusion or contained in the conclusion of the practitioner could either be reasonable or limited assurance, which we will discuss later in the classifications of assurance engagement. Let's go to the types of conclusion. We have unqualified or unmodified conclusion. So in case of unqualified or unmodified conclusion, so this is equivalent to clean conclusion. So the practitioner believes that the subject matter in all material respects conform with the criteria. And we have also modified conclusion. So in modified conclusion, so the CPA either believes that the subject matter information is materially misstated, or the practitioner was not able to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence and therefore cannot give a conclusion or opinion. So therefore, in every assurance engagement, so the goal of the parties, no, so especially the users, for them to consider that the information to be useful, so usually they're leaning to have an unqualified or clean opinion. So but of course it will still help them decide if the conclusion provided by the practitioner is modified. So that is how our conclusion or our written assurance report so assist the users in making the correct decision about a subject matter. So that's it for the fundamentals of assurance services.